Hello and welcome. This is the first video in a series of videos that serve as an introduction to Socket.io, which is a library for handling WebSockets with ease. So in this series, we're going to build a chat app where users can send messages and other users can see those messages show up in real time. In this first video, we're going to introduce you to the setup of Socket.io specifically on the server. And then in the subsequent video or videos, we're going to start working with the client as well and start establishing the connections and firing events back and forth between the server and client to make a fun app. So without any further ado, let's jump into it. Okay, so just a quick overview of the structure of this app before we jump into integrating Socket.io into it. It's a full stack app with separate client and server folders. Inside the client folder, we have a React app that was generated with Vite. And inside the server folder, we've got an Express server, and we're using SQLize with a MySQL database and a RESTful API set up just for creating and saving users. And we're handling authentication with JWT. Okay, so we want to integrate Socket.io into this thing. Eventually, you're going to need to integrate it both into the server and into the client. Let's start with the server because I think that's a little bit more intimidating because we actually have to integrate it with the server itself. So let me show you how to do that. It's not actually that hard. You just have to know what to do. Okay, so here's our Express server. If you have an Express server, it probably looks something like this. We create an instance of our server, we apply some middleware, we specify a port, and then we fire it up down here. So in order to get Socket.io integrated into this server, of course, you have to install it. This project has separate package.jsons for client and server. So within my server package.json, I've already installed Socket.io. And yeah, don't do that. But just make sure that it's installed into your package.json that the server is accessing. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and import Socket.io. So let's do that. We'll say const Socket.io equals require Socket.io. Simple as that. Then we do need to import one other module, which is the HTTP module. It's a built-in module. You don't have to install it, but we do have to import it. And we need it because we need to create a new instance of an HTTP server because that's what we'll be binding Socket.io to. We can't really bind it directly to our Express instance. So let's go ahead and import the HTTP module. We'll say const HTTP equals require HTTP. So now we're ready to create a new instance of an HTTP server. And what we'll do is we'll integrate our Express app into that so that all of this stuff that we're using, this middleware and our API routes, is still totally going to be up and running. We're not foregoing any of that. So let's create a new server instance with HTTP. That looks like this. We say HTTP dot, or sorry, we want to save it to a variable. We're going to say const server equals HTTP dot create server. And what we do is we hand our Express app to this function. So now we're creating a new HTTP server. It's saved in this variable called server, and it's already integrating this Express server that we spent so much time developing. But down here, we're starting just the Express server. We need to change that to fire up that HTTP server that we just created. And that's as simple as changing this to that variable. Simple as. So now we just need to bind Socket.io to this server. So Socket.io will need a server to bind to, and we can specify that it's going to be this HTTP server. And I'll show you how to do that. We'll say const IO. That's a common variable name for Socket.io. It represents basically all of the socket connections that we'll have. So we'll say Socket.io equals, or sorry, const IO equals Socket.io. And we specify the server first. That'll be our HTTP server. And then there are some configuration options. In this kind of setup, I do need to specify some CORS options. I need to allow the origin from the front end to make requests to this server. So I'm going to say origin and then specify the origin that my front end is running on, which is http://localhost:3000. I'm then going to specify a methods property and specify which methods I'm going to allow socket.io to use. And so you can specify all of them: get, post, delete, and put. But I only plan on using maybe get and post. Whoops. So I'm going to just include those ones. And you just include them as an array of method names like this: get, all caps, and post. Okay, so now we shouldn't run into any CORS issues with the socket.io stuff that we're going to do. So with the creation of this IO variable that represents socket.io and all of the connections that we create with it, we've basically integrated socket.io into our server. We're not doing anything with it yet, but it is set up. So once it's set up, what do? Well, you might want to restart your app and make sure it doesn't get any errors on the server, and it doesn't. What do you do with this IO variable? It's not being called yet. The way socket.io works, both on the front end and the server here, is you basically set up event listeners. The event listeners can be called whatever you want. They listen for events that are emitted by the other side. So we're here on the server. If an event is emitted by the client, we will set up a listener for that particular event. So we give these events names. We might have an event called message. And when you emit a message event from the front end, you might pass along some data with that. You have that option. You're allowed to pass along basically a singular JavaScript object that can hold a bunch of information that you might need. Or it could just be a singular string. So you set up these listeners, and then on the other end, you can emit an event with the same name, and that will trigger the callback function of that listener on the other side. So I'll show you what that looks like. First, we have to set up an event listener for a socket connection being formed. And so I mentioned that you can name the events whatever you want. That's true, but there are some built-in ones, one of which is connection. So we're going to create an event listener for a connection event, which fires when a socket connection is formed. So we say io.on. That's how we create a listener onto one of these socket.io objects. We say .on, which is similar to like the jQuery syntax for creating a event listener within the browser. But so we'll say io.on, and then the first argument is the name of the event, and they have it right here. It's connection. And it takes in an argument which represents the individual socket connection being created. So let's do that. Let's specify the event name that we're listening for, connection. And then we'll write a callback function that has the argument representing an individual socket connection. So that'll be an arrow function like this. So we have to do this first. We have to listen for a connection event to set up our own custom event listeners, such as listening for a message or whatever. The reason being, you have to have a socket connection before you can properly set up an event listener for a message or what have you. So it would be within this that you set up an event listener. Now, if you're making a complicated app that is like a game or something like that, that might have all sorts of different kinds of events that can happen, those listeners might, become rather numerous, and this to do so in one file like this would be pretty messy. We're not going to do that. We're only really going to be creating a simple chat app that'll probably only involve listening for messages. But in the case of having a more complicated app, what you would do is you would modularize and group your listeners together. Say you had some game logic, you would have a separate file called game listeners or something like that, and you would have a function that sets up all of those event listeners. You would export that function and call it within here, within this connection event callback function. Okay, so one thing we can do within this connection callback function is we can console log something like connected. But we could also set up an event listener. So let's say we're expecting that maybe the client will emit an event called message. When either side, either the server or client, emits an event, they can also pass along data. They can pass along a JavaScript object. So we can then receive that data and do what we want with it. So let's create a listener for a message event. And what we do is we apply that listener to the individual socket connection. So we say socket dot on. Now this socket connection is listening for an event called message. And let's say we know that when a message event is emitted, it will also include a string. Maybe it's not a complex JavaScript object, it's just a simple string. You can certainly pass along a string. So we'll give our callback function an argument name of message like that. And you could console log it. You could say console log, and you go message received. Hopefully I spelled that right. And then, show your message. All right, MSG, like that. So this is the basic setup for socket events. You could then, in turn, emit an event back to the front end, but we haven't set up the client yet, so we're not going to do that quite yet. But this is how you set up the server side with Socket IO. To review, what we did is we went to our server and we imported Socket IO and saved it to a variable. We also imported the HTTP module, saved that to a variable. We created a new server instance using the http.createServer method and handed it our already existing Express server. And then we made sure that it was this newly created server that we're actually starting up and not the original Express server. Then we create this IO variable, which represents our socket connections, and we give it that server to work with. We specified some CORS options so that we wouldn't run into CORS issues on the front end. And with that, we're ready to start applying event listeners to this socket IO variable. And so we began doing that down here. And as I mentioned, it's important to start with this connection event. In the event of a socket connection being created, the socket itself, the individual socket connection, passes an argument to this callback function, and we can do what we wish with it. We can console log its ID or maybe some of its other properties, or we can apply a listener to that specific socket connection. And then we've done that here. We're listening for an event called message, and we're expecting that it's going to pass along like a string as its data object. And so that gets accessed with the argument here in our callback function, and we're just console logging it. Granted, we haven't set up the client side yet. We're going to do that in part 2 of this Intro to Socket IO series. But this is a very, very good start for getting set up with Socket IO, having it running on your server. And of course, you want to make sure that your server doesn't run into any crashing errors, and it doesn't. So stay tuned for part 2. We'll get started with setting up Socket IO on the client, and then these two sides can start firing events back and forth and passing along information and having all kinds of fun. So I hope this gets you excited about setting up some WebSockets with Socket IO. Stay tuned for part 2. And as always, happy coding. All right, folks, take care.